Well, all right. Welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Are the stars out tonight? I don't know if it's cloudy or bright.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode. If you follow us on Instagram or on our YouTube channel, you probably saw that I put out just a short, like 45-second video the other day, saying, I recognize it's been a while since we put an episode up. I was just saying sorry about that. It's been crazy, just really, really busy lately. If you're watching, you can see that Nerva's not actually in the studio with me today because she has just been burning at both ends, teaching at school, and now she's starting classes again. And So I'm just rolling solo today on this subject. But yeah, and by the way, if you want to follow us on Instagram in particular, I don't like Instagram, obviously, but it is what it is. That's where most of people have historically followed us before we knew they were the spawn of Lucifer. Anyways, you can follow us there at Freemind FM, and I'm probably going to post more, just like little, engagements day to day on there coming up, and our YouTube channel as well. Maybe I'll try to put them up on Rumble as well. So anyways, if you're not following us on those, I would kind of recommend you do that, because I'm going to do stuff in between episodes, just kind of hitting stuff as it comes along, so we don't have to wait so long to kind of sit down and do these full episodes. So, but anyways, yeah, I have been hesitant to kind of jump in, especially with all the stuff going on with Israel. Partly because, it's not a subject that I've studied in depth for a long time. Like on the theological side, I've looked into it a good bit from different perspectives. But as far as the geopolitical stuff and the history of Israel, the modern state of Israel, all that kind of stuff, it's just not an area I know super well. So, when you're getting into stuff like where there's war going on and just, man, the atrocities that are happening and the heightened emotions and the camps and the disagreements, just makes me a little hesitant to want to jump into this thing at all. And two, it's like this started a few weeks ago, and a lot of people have already said a lot of really good things. So what else are you going to get on here and add? But I was tempted to just kind of go past it and jump on to the next topic. But a couple people have reached out and said, "Hey, what are you thinking on this? Do you have any good sources you can pass to us to help us make sense of what's going on there, and what, how should we be thinking about this biblically, and how should we be praying, and all that kind of stuff, interacting on social media." And so I said, okay, even though it's not like my area, there are a few things that it touches that I have looked at in the past. And so what I'm going to do is maybe break this up into a few different small segments, and just kind of give a framework of what I see as sort of the presuppositions that many people bring to the table as they're discussing this, to maybe help you parse through it and see okay, what are the factors that contribute to coming down on these conclusions on this issue, specifically with regard to theology and something like just war theory. And then with that, I'm just going to kind of offer you a bunch of sources and resources that you can look into on your own that I think are helpful, at least maybe not even describing my own perspective, which I'm still coming to on this issue, but they will be good versions of various perspectives on this issue that I think are worth looking into. I've picked on the colleges and higher education, on this podcast, not because of the idea of higher education. I think higher education done rightly is a beautiful thing, a needed thing, a necessary thing. Good Christian scholarship is needed, and you can do that rightly, but more from the perspective of what has happened to higher education, specifically in Western civilization, and even that is encroached into the Christian universities in many cases, if not most cases. I've picked on that because it has departed from a biblical understanding of what it means to grow in wisdom and grow in knowledge. But I think one of the good aspects that has been helpful for me in doing when I started the master's degree at Biola in science and religion, and then kind of shifted over here to Liberty now in apologetics. One of the things that I think can be helpful for people is to read outside of your perspective. And of course, you want to do that at the right season, at the right maturity level. You don't want to be, a high school sophomore who doesn't, is not trained at all in logic, and you just start reading, Richard Dawkins' book because that's the other camp, and you want to read outside of your perspective. That's not what I'm talking about. That's just kind of foolish, running into enemy territory without any weapons or any protection. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here, though, is as you mature in your theological understanding, you want to, if nothing else, read within the realms of orthodoxy of different positions, especially when it comes to, secondary issues like, cessationism versus continuationism, or, the age of the earth. In this case, we're going to be looking a little bit at eschatological views, as well as I don't know what the category is, but, dispensationalism versus covenantal theology, and how those things kind of connect to something called Zionism. And what I'm going to say here is that I don't really have a dog in the fight so much with this issue, even when it comes to the eschatology, pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill type categories. Not because I don't think it's important, but because I really am still searching in this area. I've been doing a lot of reading over the past few years because I see how it actually connects as well to things like how do we act in the, with the public square, which is the mission of the church. How do we, prepare for the future? Are we just kind of waiting for the rapture? Are we, investing as though that the kingdom is going to, kind of advance and we're still in the early church period now, which some post-mill advocates have suggested. So these things connect, but I think there's a lot more there than I initially thought. I think I thought, man, I could probably get, land on a view within a year of study, and it's now, I don't know, 4 or 5 years later, I'm still kind of working through it. I have shifted some on that stuff, but I haven't come to a place where I can say, man, this is where I'm at, and I want to go to the mat for this view. But what I do want to do is kind of provide maybe the really short snapshots. This would just be a primer, if anything, into these areas, but give you more sources that I think are good sources to help you pursue growing in that as well. So I found I'm going to pull up my Bible software here. This is another thing I just saw the other day. You guys might have seen it as well, floating around on Twitter, but Logos. Anyways, my Bible software, Logos, they put up a advertisement, a marketing thing where they're promoting Asian voices. And of course, they rightfully got, just ripped up and down. And I'm like, am I going to have to find a new Bible software now? So if you guys got any good recommendations, I might do it. I'm deep into Logos. I've invested a lot of money over the years in this program and buying these books. So it would be a hard shift. And, it's one strike, and it's, it's not the end of the world, but it is frustrating. That's the kind of day we're living in. We got to deal with this, the woke encroachment on even your Bible software. So, but here we go. I want to start with this. This is out of the Dictionary of Christianity in America, and it's called Zionism and American Christianity. Okay, so I'm going to read through this, maybe make some comments from time to time, but it says, derived from the ancient name Zion, of the mountain site of the fortress city of Jerusalem, or the Temple Mount, Zionism as a concept is rooted in the traditions of ancient Israel. It relates to the persistent belief that God's covenant with his people, the Jews, is linked to Palestine and Jerusalem in particular, and that the land is rightfully theirs. Biblical references such as Genesis 12:7, 15:18, 35:12, Numbers 34, 2-12, Deuteronomy 35, Joshua 15, 1-12, and Isaiah 11:16 have frequently been used to establish this inextricable connection. Since biblical times, this land tradition has been an integral component of Jewish hopes and dreams, an unshakable expectation during 19 centuries of exile of returning to Zion. In the late 19th and 20th century, Zionism became enfleshed in a movement that has attracted a broad spectrum of American Christians, although they are a minority, numerically speaking. Among many conservative evangelical Christians, Zionism has been accorded a prominent role as a fulfillment of prophecy, as one of the preconditions for the return of Christ. This second coming of the Messiah, in line with premillennial views, will establish the long-awaited kingdom of God, a kingdom which will last for 1,000 years and be followed by the last judgment. So notice the connection here. There's a connection between Zionism and premillennialism. Now, if you're wondering, like, what's the default, and I'm going to read about premillennialism in a minute, but if you're thinking, man, what's the default theology in America? It's by and large in evangelical circles, it's premillennialism of one sort or another. I would say dispensationalism, which is it's a particular type of very detailed premillennialism that departs from historic premillennialism, by the way, and it's more of a new thing last couple centuries. Dispensationalism is probably the most popular version of how to kind of systematically understand the ages in the Bible and in eschatology, and many of us have inherited that. That's sort of the area that I grew up in. Both Church of God, Assembly of God, and in many of the Baptist circles I've rolled in over time, I think would all be committed to a dispensational version of premillennialism, including, I believe, Liberty University, where we're at now. And so he was saying that Zionism, in their view of this writer, is more of a numerically minority position. And I would say he's probably right with regard to the extreme versions of it where people are like super, super into Zionism. But I would say that the dispensationalism, which often has Zionism kind of is part of the, it naturally comes along with dispensationalism. So it's kind of tucked in there to the majority view, if that makes sense. So I'm going to continue on here reading. Among early Christian Zionists, William Blackstone. Now, this isn't the William Blackstone of the law commentaries, but maybe in the same family, I'm not sure. William Blackstone was a formidable figure, acknowledged as the father of American Christian Zionism. He worked tirelessly for several decades on behalf of a Jewish homeland in Israel. High visibility was given to his efforts through his endeavor to persuade President Benjamin Harrison to contact world leaders in the interests of an international conference on Zionist aspirations. This is in 1891, okay? So over 1 million copies of his book, Jesus is Coming, were sold. Another outstanding leader was Arno C. I don't know how to pronounce this guy's last name, Gebelin, whose journal, Our Hope, founded in 1894, kept readers in touch not only with theological and biblical commentaries on Zionism, but reported on the international prophecy conferences and political movements related to the restoration of the nation. So you can see this kind of starting at, late 1800s. Continuing on here, Dwight L. Moody, and you probably heard of, Moody, famous, preacher, revivalist, in his own ministry and in the establishment of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, gave consistent encouragement and support to the Zionist cause. So Zionism, really, as Moody was going around doing a lot of powerful work in evangelism, he also promoted Zionism and popularized it during this time period. Other conservative evangelicals who have zealously affirmed the movement toward Jewish rights to a homeland include R.A. Torrey. R.A. Torrey, by the way, I think he was the co-founder of Biola, if I'm not mistaken, which is an acronym, Bible Institute of L.A. And so a lot of, like Moody Bible Institute, a lot of these Bible institutes were popping up in the early 1900s during the modernist fundamentalist controversy. So you had the Princeton greats, and J. Gratian Machen was fighting, and many others, B.B. Warfield before him, but Machen in particular was fighting against the encroaching liberalism that was taking place in Princeton and these other, originally Christian-founded universities that were swinging to the theological left. They were fighting as far as they could, but didn't seem to be able to withstand the onslaught, and so people eventually started leaving those universities and starting Bible institutes, and that's part of this whole greater movement. A lot of these guys that moved to these Bible institutes, these Bible schools, carried Zionism with them. So, R.A. Torrey, James M. Gray, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Billy Graham. Christian Zionism has also been prominent among mainline Protestants as well as Catholics throughout the 20th century. Rather than being connected with the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, however, the foundation of their perspective has primarily been a moral commitment to a people grievously persecuted and maltreated through the centuries. The Holocaust, with its denial to Jews of human dignity and the right to survive, is viewed as the climax of this injustice. So he's saying, you had Torrey and Graham and Robertson, and they were all kind of theologically committed to this idea that the Jews they have a right to their homeland. So there was that. And then there's this other group, the mainline Protestants, which weren't necessarily committed to that idea, but they did see the Jews as historically persecuted. In that sense, they should, have this place where they can come together. Initially, I'll play a little short synopsis video, maybe in the next part or the part after, where they kind of give a brief overview of the history of, and I think where Jews started fleeing Germany in the 1930s, to this area of what then, I guess, some people refer to as Palestine. I don't remember what it was called specifically. But so in that case, I think some of these leaders would say, we need to make a safe place for them to flee. They've been persecuted, especially after World War II, for them to come together and kind of have a place of their own. So that was a different motivation there. So continue on here. The American Palestine Committee was commenced in 1932, merging with the Christian Council on Palestine and becoming the American Christian Palestine Committee. By 1942, there were over 1,200 members, and by 1946, approximately 15,000, including clergy and lay members. Throughout the U.S., over 100 local chapters were organized. Their primary goal was to arouse the American Christian conscience toward a Zionist resolution of a homeland for dispossessed Jews. So sort of along the lines of what I was just saying. Reinhold Niebuhr was an ardent spokesperson for the American Christian Palestine Committee, advocating for a haven for Jewish refugees in Palestine and subsequently supporting the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Other Christian contemporaries of Niebuhr who espoused similar Zionist views were W.F. Albright, Francis J. McConnell, Ralph Sockman, Daniel Poling, and Paul Tillich. Currently, among the exponents of this heritage are Frank Little, Roy and Alice Eckert, John Palikowski, Eugene Fisher, Edward Flannery, and Isaac C. Rottenberg. I don't know if you guys are familiar. I'm not familiar with those guys. So, several have channeled their support through the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel and the National Conference of Christian Jews. Almost done with this article, by the way. So, Christian Zionists reject the view that the biblical promises made to ancient Israel were abrogated by the coming of Christ and were superseded by the establishment of the church. Okay, so not like Christian non-Zionists, a lot of times, sometimes they're called, advocates of replacement theology. Although I'll get to that later, and some of them don't like that language, but they would hold that no, at least in some cases, some of the land promises to Israel, that thing were, that they were either ended or, when God, in essence, some would say divorced Israel, physical Israel at the end of the Old Covenant, culminating in the temple destruction, AD 70, and basically the church was grafted into true Israel, which were those that accepted the Messiah. Some call that fulfillment theology rather than replacement theology. But the idea there is that there's no current promises to Israel. Maybe some would hold it I guess due to Romans 11, that we will see this, the evangelization of all of Israel, of modern Jews, and that will kind of culminate toward the end times. Others see that as actually being fulfilled in the first century, prior to the destruction of the temple. But the big point here is the Christian Zionists reject that view, that those were superseded by the establishment of the church, and so they would hold that the land still is due to modern Israelites, to modern Jewish folks. And so that's basically a really short sketch of Zionism. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, this is tied to the theological framework called dispensationalism. I'm going to read this little article about that. So, dispensationalism is a hermeneutical approach to the Bible that became a movement within American evangelicalism after the 1870s. The term originates from, I don't know how to say this Greek word, oikonomia, and its derivatives, which appear about 20 times in the Greek New Testament and mean, quote, to manage, regulate, administer, and plan the affairs of a household, unquote. See Luke 16, 1-2, Ephesians 1:10, 3:2, 9, Colossians 1:25. When used of God, the word refers to his sovereign plan for the world. At the heart of dispensationalism is the dividing of all time into distinguishable economies or dispensations. So it divides time into dispensations, which are seen as different stages in God's progressive revelation. C.I. Scofield, a leading exponent of dispensationalism, defined a dispensation as a period of time during which man is tested in respect of obedience to some specific revelation of the will of God. So now you may or may not remember the name Scofield, but the Scofield Reference Bibles really popularized dispensational theology. So they had the notes, the commentary notes all throughout the Bible, and that was definitely their position. And so during different eras, during different dispensations through progressive revelation history, God judged different groups differently and held them to different standards, that kind of thing. Furthermore, these periods are marked off, says Scofield, in Scripture by some change in God's method of dealing with mankind. Each of the dispensations may be regarded as a new test of the natural man, and each ends in judgment, making his utter failure in every dispensation. Though many Christians have used historical periodization, so in other words, this idea of historical periods in which God deals with different people differently is not necessarily unique to dispensationalists. It's kind of how they do it is part of what makes it unique. But that has been a typical understanding, theologians, throughout the ages. But it says, though many Christians have used historical periodization, John Nelson Darby, who lived from 1800 to 1882, was the first to create a full-blown system of interpretation. So the 1800s, an early leader of the Plymouth Brethren in Great Britain, Darby was a futurist premillennialist who believed that Christ will return before the millennium and that biblical prophecies of the last days were yet to be fulfilled. To these ideas, Darby added a literalistic hermeneutic and the strict separation of Israel and the church. So, whereas other theologians will see true Israel as made up of the church, Jew and Gentile, who, are regenerated, come to faith in Christ. And there might be still, Jews in the flesh that God has something like Romans 11, but by and large, God always has one people. It was physical Israel in the Old Covenant, the church in the New Covenant, made up of where Gentiles are engrafted into true Israel. For Darby, he makes this kind of hard separation between Israel and the church. So Darby saw in Scripture two totally distinct divine plans for history, one concerning an earthly people, Israel, the other a heavenly people, the church. God's plan for Israel was revealed through a series of covenants, Adamic, Mosaic, and Davidic, which pointed to the establishment of a messianic kingdom on the earth. But when Messiah came, Israel rejected him. God then postponed the kingdom, turned away from Israel, and created out of the Gentiles a new people, the church. According to this postponement theory, God will not resume his dealings with Israel until he finishes building the church and raptures it to heaven. Then the quote-unquote great parentheses in prophetic time will end, and the events of the last days will take place. The Great Tribulation, the rise of the Antichrist and the false prophet, the battle of Armageddon, the second coming of Christ, the binding of Satan, and the setting up of the millennial kingdom. You probably recognize that rubric. So, this kind of rubric largely, at least to this level of detail, it started with Darby. Now, historic premillennialism, which we'll talk about in a minute, goes all the way back. Many have church historians have said that this is actually the earliest version of eschatology taught by the church fathers. That'd be historic premillennialism that differs from this version of dispensationalism in different ways. We'll see in a minute. But this version is like the Left Behind, series. This is the kind that most of us are most familiar with, and we kind of just accept by default. Initially, not all premillennialists accepted Darby's views. Especially controversial was his doctrine of the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, which split his own Plymouth Brethren. Darby's dispensationalism came to America in the 1870s. During a series of preaching tours, Darby won over a number of influential evangelical pastors and teachers, including, again, this name, William E. Blackstone, James H. Brooks, James M. Gray, and C.I. Schofield. Dispensational views spread into conservative evangelicalism through the Bible and prophetic conference movement. Specifically, there was these Niagara conferences that took place about that time, and that's where this Darby's ideas really spread. So it spread through the Niagara conferences, the Bible Institutes, a number of influential journals, and most importantly, like I said before, the Schofield Reference Bible from 1909 and was revised in 1967. Schofield identified 7 dispensations: innocence, conscience, human government, promise, law, grace, and kingdom, and articulated what became the standard dispensational approach in America. Though rejected at first by many conservatives, by the 1920s, it eclipsed other kinds of premillennialism and became closely identified with the fundamentalist movement, thanks to able teachers like Arno C. Gabelin, Harry Ironside, Louis S. Chafer, who founded Dallas Theological Seminary in 1924 and wrote the movement's most influential Systematic Theology in 1947. In the 1980s, the dispensationalism finds able defenders in John Walvoord, Charles C. Ryrie, many of you probably are familiar with his commentaries, J. Dwight Pentecost, all from Dallas Theological Seminary, and is the most common view of eschatology taught in fundamentalist schools and churches. So that's, dispensationalism in a nutshell. You can get, super into the details of variation on the views and all that kind of stuff. But that's important to know. So that this idea goes back to Darby, really, in the 1800s. Now, just because it had a late development obviously doesn't mean it's false. That would be the genetic fallacy to say, well, it came from here, therefore it's false. But it should kind of give us pause to say, man, like rapture theology, really, I think we tend to think that is the historic teaching of the church throughout the ages, but really this kind of rapture theology where there's really connected to the 70 weeks of Daniel, where the weeks are correlated to years, and you have these weeks that lead into the coming of Christ, the first advent of Christ when he comes, to live and die. And then you have this parentheses because the Jews rejected their Messiah. where the church age happens in dispensationalism. Then you have this, this kind of other coming of Christ where it's a rapture and the church is taken out. Then you have the final week to get you to the 70 weeks. And that's the Great Tribulation. All that rubric came about in the 1800s, primarily through John Nelson Darby, and then was further developed by these other thinkers, and then kind of picked up and really given theological weight by Dallas Theological Seminary, spread throughout. That, again, this is the Left Behind series, The Water We Swim In. And it also is connected with this idea, things get worse and worse. Now, thankfully, people that, many people that advocate this haven't taken a passive position. So, for instance, I think the one of the key figures there that you saw was, Jerry Falwell, who became very involved in politics. Although I think at first, having that theology, he didn't think that Christians should be involved in politics, but later came to change his mind on that, and he saw the great evil that was happening, thankfully, through abortion, and started, not only got involved, but really took lead and took charge, and now we, although many, of course, non-Christians can't stand him, we owe a great debt, to the things he did. So thankfully, many of the people who advocate this sort of dispensationalism, where it seems more consistent to not be involved with quote unquote earthly things and to kind of let things get worse. One of the ideas was, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? It's one of the classic statements of dispensationalism. Like, why are you guys getting involved in all these things like, politics and entertainment and education? The highest thing we can do is just preach the gospel and rescue souls because the ship is going down. And I think that is the most consistent view with dispensationalism. Although, again, if you're a dispensationalist and you're inconsistent, I'm thankful. But just note that is a late development, doesn't make it necessarily false, but it should give us a little pause and say, man, what were the views outside of that, and is that actually the strongest view? So what I want to look at now is historic premillennialism. So let me pull that up. While I'm pulling that up, just a quick note on dispensationalism. So I think it was, I don't know if it's 2 years ago, but Michael Brown and Craig Keener co-wrote a book. I think it's called Who's Afraid of the Antichrist or something like that. But I read the book a while back. I asked Dr. Keener some questions about it when he did the podcast episode with us, I don't know, maybe about a year and a half ago. And in this book, they are both committed to historic premillennialism, but they reject the rapture theology. And this book gives, I think, a pretty good case if you're interested to say, man, what are the arguments from premillennialists that accept this idea that Christ will return and then there'll be a 1,000-year reign on the earth before the final judgment. What are the arguments for them against the rapture theology? I would check that book out when you have a chance. And, like I said, this isn't a final word. I'm giving you kind of like stuff to do further research on, but I found it pretty persuasive on, like, what does it mean in Thessalonians when it talks about being caught with, believers will be caught up with Jesus and there they will be with him. Is that rapture theology in the Bible? What do you do with, Daniel's 70 weeks? Is that the best way to understand this kind of thing? So they go into those things in detail in a couple chapters, and they give a lot more reasons. Two people in a field, one is taken, the other's left. And, what does that mean exegetically? So check that book out when you get a chance. But here is, I'm going to get into this. This will help you understand maybe what premillennialism is. So this is the belief that there will be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth at the end of the present age. So let me pause there real quick. Basically, all the eschatological positions are built, the words are built around something called the millennial period or the millennium. And that really comes out of Revelation 20, where we see Satan is bound and kept from deceiving the nations for 1,000 years. and basically Christ rules. There's like this first resurrection kind of thing. So that's where at least these different paradigms hinge for whatever reason around that chapter in Revelation. So to give you a quick sketch, pre-mill, that means, Christ returns prior to that happening, prior to that 1,000-year time where Christ reigns, and there's this first resurrection of believers. Satan's bound up before he's loosed one final time before the final judgment comes. Postmillennialism, we'll talk about, that's Christ comes after. So I'll get into the details of that when we read it, but on that view, when Christ comes, the end, the final judgment happens right then, and death is the final enemy that's taken care of. Amillennialism is similar in that sense that Christ comes, the end happens, but they don't necessarily see things as getting better, whereas the post-mills think the kingdom of God, like leaven, will come in the earth, and we will see the nation subdued under Christ, and that we'll see the victory of God here prior to that return. Amills tend to see both side by side, the good and evil. Good continues to get better, evil continues to get worse, wheat and tares kind of thing before Christ returns. So pre-mill view, though, things get worse and worse. It tends to be what's called a pessimistic eschatology. So if you think back to John MacArthur's recent video that went viral, where he says we lose down here. That's a good expression. I mean, although pre-mill advocates probably don't like that kind of language, but I think that does express at least partially the idea, like before the second advent or before the return of Christ. In essence, the church loses, the enemy keeps control. The enemy is still, Satan is still the god of this world. He wins, but in winning the world, he still ultimately loses, because Christ comes back and he punishes the wicked and separates it out, and makes a new heaven and new earth. Eventually, after that 1,000 years, which is kind of a weird thing that even when I asked Dr. Keener about it, he didn't have a lot of details on the 1,000 years themselves and how to put all that stuff together. But anyways, so let me get back to this article here. It says this teaching is based on Revelation 21 through 10, elaborated by certain Old Testament texts such as Isaiah 55 through 66, which teach that there will be a time of justice, peace, and righteousness on earth. Generally, premillennialists believe that the kingdom of Christ will be preceded by certain signs, such as the preaching of gospel to all nations, a great apostasy, wars, famines, earthquakes, the appearance of the Antichrist, and a period of great tribulation. So they share, like, historic pre-mill advocates, which, like I said, does go back to early church fathers, share the pessimism of dispensationalism. We should expect to see these sorts of signs, like gospel goes to all nations. You'll even see that, for instance, in the AG world, which is more dispensational, the rapture theology is part of it. Well, it was when, back when I was going to school at Southeastern, part of the 16 fundamental doctrines. But they, I think, oftentimes will couch their message of the Great Commission and reaching all the nations. Like, once we reach the nations, then Christ returns. Once we reach every nation with the gospel. And so there's still some unreached tribes in the hills of, South America and hills in Africa, or Papua New Guinea, all these kinds of things. Like, once we reach every nation like that, there's really nothing left besides maybe the rise of the Antichrist, great apostasy, increase of wars, earthquakes, all that stuff happening. But we shouldn't expect to see any kind of rapture. This will just all culminate in the return of Christ, where he sets up his kingdom here for 1,000 years. That would be the Brown Keener position. So it says, during the millennium, the Jews will be converted and will become zealous Christian missionaries. Nature will have its curse removed and produce abundant crops, and evil will be restrained through the authoritarian rule of Christ. Despite these idyllic conditions, there is a final rebellion against Christ and his saints. However, God destroys those evil forces and the eternal states of heaven and hell are established. Many premillennialists have taught that during the 1,000 years, dead or martyred believers will be resurrected with glorified bodies to intermingle with the other inhabitants of the earth. In the 20th century, premillennialism has been identified with dispensationalism, although it is not necessary to follow such a rigid chronology of biblical interpretation to believe in the premillennial view. Hence, again, what I said earlier, where Brown and Keener hold to premill but not dispensationalism. So, at least not the kind advocated by Darby and others in his lineage of thought. So another aspect of that, a lot of premill folks like Brown, for instance, is a Christian Zionist. I think he is a Messianic Jew of Jewish descent. I think he would call himself Messianic. So you do have this connection, like the premill, especially premill dispensationalists, but they're going to be committed by and large to this idea of Zionism, where this land is that is, God's promise to the children of Abraham, not Hagar and Abraham with Ishmael, but on the Isaac side, the Jews, the people of Israel, that is the promised land from them, and that still carries to this day, and that's often connected to their eschatology and the signs of the times. So that's why whenever stuff happens to Israel, you'll see the dispensationalists will be right there to talk about, here's what's going on the prophetic timeline, and Jesus is coming soon, he's coming soon, this kind of thing. So on the other hand, I think we did ask Dr. Keener, about his connection with Israel and his view of premillennialism, and he said I think how he worded it was he wasn't quite as confident as Dr. Brown was about the whole way of mapping out Israel's connection to end times and this great revival that was supposed to take place and all that. So I don't know. You can go check that out if it's on there. Maybe on the Patreon only, but I'll try to pull it out of there if I get a chance. Let's see how. Oh, we're going really long here. So let me pause here for this part, just before we go into post-millennialism, and then we'll come back to that next part. So, no, I know it's gonna be a little dry, but hopefully it's giving you some idea of where these theological positions kind of map out and how they can play into one's views on Israel and what's going on in this modern moment. So anyways, we'll get into the other part next time. So see you for part 2 here in a minute.